10-year-old Malik had never known the warmth of a home. Every night, he slept on cold concrete, curled under a thin blanket near the back alley of a subway station. The ground was hard, the air biting, but it was the only place he could find some semblance of safety. Malik had never known what it was like to fall asleep in a soft bed, to be tucked in or kissed goodnight. For him, the night was simply a time to endure, to wait for another day to begin. The world around him was bright, fast, and full of people who didn't see him. They moved in a blur, walking past with their heads held high, their eyes fixed ahead, unaware of the boy sitting in the shadows. They were dressed in expensive clothes, carrying designer bags, as if he were invisible. To them, Malik didn't exist. He was just another face in the crowd of those who had been forgotten, those whose lives didn't matter. His stomach growled constantly, an ache he had grown used to. He didn't have the luxury of 3 meals a day like the people who passed him by. The only food he got was what he could scavenge from trash bins behind fast food restaurants, or the occasional scraps that fell from the hands of strangers who never stopped to notice him. Sometimes, a kind soul would toss him a few coins, but most of the time he was left hungry, fighting to survive. The mall security chased him away every time he tried to find shelter inside during the winter months. The cold winds cut through his thin jacket, and his skin would turn numb. But it didn't matter. The guards didn't care. They saw him as nothing more than a nuisance, an inconvenience. They would shout at him to leave, to go back to wherever he came from, as if he had any place to go. People called him dirty, a thief, a beggar. He had heard it all before. Every insult stung, but they were just words, words that didn't mean anything, in a world that had already written him off. No one ever asked if he was okay, if he had a place to sleep or a meal to eat. No one cared. But Malik wasn't just a boy in the shadows. He wasn't defined by the insults thrown at him or the poverty he had been born into. All he wanted was a chance at something more than this life. A meal that didn't come from a trash bin. A life that wasn't spent hiding in alleys, invisible to the world. His dreams were simple. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to matter. But what happens when the boy they ignored becomes the only one who can save them? Malik had spent his life watching from the sidelines, invisible to everyone around him. But that night, everything changed. The same people who had looked past him, the ones who thought they were untouchable in their world of wealth and privilege, would soon realize that Malik was the one who held the key to their survival. It wasn't just a change of luck or fate. It was a moment of reckoning. The boy who had been written off, who had been overlooked and discarded, was about to step into a role no one had ever imagined. And as he stood there in the shadows, watching the chaos unfold before him, Malik knew one thing for certain. He wasn't invisible anymore. This time, the world would see him, and he would save them all. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? What kind of books you read, let us know in the comments. The one time Malik stepped into the mall, everything changed. Malik had snuck into the huge, luxurious shopping mall just to escape the freezing air outside. The cold was biting, his thin jacket barely enough to keep him warm, and the large building offered some relief from the winter chill. He knew he didn't belong here, but no one ever paid attention to him when he stayed in the corner, just out of sight. The constant rush of people, the clatter of shoes on polished floors, was a noise he had grown used to. As Malik wandered through the mall, his eyes drifted to the food court, and the smell of burgers, fries, and fresh bread made his stomach ache. He hadn't had a decent meal in days, and his mouth watered at the thought of just a few bites. But he didn't have any money. So he kept walking, hoping no one would ask why he was there. And then he saw them. A wealthy white family, untouchable, perfect. The father, a tall man dressed in a sharp suit, looked every bit the billionaire he probably was. His wife, wearing designer clothes and a perfect smile, pushed a stroller with a toddler giggling inside. The little boy, no older than 3, had bright blonde hair and a stuffed animal clutched tightly in his small hands. His laughter was carefree, and as he kicked his feet, Malik couldn't help but watch in silence. The family's world seemed so different from his. They had everything: money, comfort, a life filled with safety and love. Malik envied the boy, but not for the things he owned or the status that came with his family. He envied him for something deeper, for having parents who cared, for having a home that was warm, a place to belong. It was something Malik had never experienced. He had always been alone, abandoned, or passed from one foster home to the next. Each place only temporary, never a place where he could truly feel at peace. The sight of the little boy in his stroller, content and loved, was a bitter reminder of everything Malik had missed. His thoughts lingered on it for just a moment, but then something caught his eye, pulling him from his daydream. A man. He was standing at a distance, just outside the food court. He wasn't shopping or passing by. His eyes were fixed on the family, on the billionaire father, the mother, and the child in the stroller. His gaze was intense, his expression dark. There was nothing friendly about it. It was the way someone might watch a target, a strange mix of focus and calculation. Malik felt a chill run down his spine, the warmth from the food court suddenly feeling distant and unreal. The man's eyes flicked from the toddler to the parents, and then back again, his face still devoid of any emotion. Something about his presence felt off. He wasn't just admiring the family from afar. No, his gaze had the intensity of someone who had a plan, a purpose. Malik instinctively stepped back into the shadows, out of sight, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew better than anyone what it felt like to be the victim of someone's attention, someone who had the power to ruin lives. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, and Malik tried to force himself to look away, to pretend he hadn't noticed. But the man's cold stare sent a shiver through him. Malik wasn't sure why, but in that instant he knew something was wrong. Something was about to happen. He was no hero. No one would notice a boy like him, just a homeless kid trying to survive. But as he watched the man's eyes narrow, something inside him clicked. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't walk away. The question wasn't whether he could help. It was whether he should. But as he stood there, hidden in the shadows, one thing became clear. This moment was different. His life, the one he had always lived in the margins, was about to collide with the world of those who had everything. When the unthinkable happened, Malik was the only one paying attention. The scene in the mall was like any other. Shoppers strolled around, the chatter of voices filling the air, the scent of food and perfume mixing in the bustling environment. The family was still there. Father talking on his phone, his back turned for just a moment. The mother browsing clothes on a nearby rack, her attention diverted by the endless selection of items. It was the perfect opportunity. And that's when the man struck. Malik had been standing at the edge of the food court, his eyes still lingering on the family. It wasn't curiosity that kept him watching. It was that same feeling that had haunted him for years, the sense that something in the world wasn't right, that something was always about to happen. He didn't know why, but when the kidnapper, a man dressed in a security guard uniform, appeared, something inside Malik told him to pay attention. The man wasn't just walking by. No, he moved toward the stroller with a practiced ease, bending down and casually unbuckling the toddler without anyone noticing. The little boy, still clutching his stuffed animal, whimpered softly as the stranger scooped him up, but he didn't scream. The man whispered something in his ear, and the boy, surprisingly, remained silent. Not a single person in the crowd seemed to notice. The mother was still distracted by the clothes in her hand, glancing through hangers without a care in the world. The billionaire father, too absorbed in his phone call, didn't look up once. The shoppers around them walked by, oblivious to the scene unfolding right before their eyes. Malik's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced as he understood what was happening. A kidnapping, right in front of him. The thought made his blood run cold. He had seen enough in his life to recognize a threat when he saw one, and this was not some harmless mistake. Without thinking, Malik sprang into action. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't allow this child to be taken right in front of him while no one else even noticed. "Hey, that's not your baby!" Malik shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. The kidnapper's head snapped toward him. His eyes widened, a flash of panic crossing his face before he quickly masked it with an expression of indifference. The man didn't waste a second. Without a word, he turned and ran, pushing through the crowd with speed that belied his appearance as a security guard. Malik's instincts kicked in. He didn't think twice. He had no time to. With the adrenaline coursing through him, he bolted after the man, weaving through the crowded mall, his legs burning with every step. The chaos around him only made it harder to focus. Shouts of confusion echoed through the air, and people started to realize what was happening. But by then, it was too late. The kidnapper was fast, but Malik was determined. He pushed through the panic, moving faster than he ever had before. Every second counted. "Stop!" Malik shouted again, his voice hoarse. But the man didn't stop. He was heading toward the exit, toward the door that led to the parking lot and beyond. Malik's heart raced, but his mind stayed focused. The crowd had started to notice now, people calling for security. But Malik knew the kidnapper was almost out of reach. He couldn't let him get away. With one final burst of energy, Malik lunged forward, grabbing the man's arm just as he reached the door. The kidnapper tried to shake him off, but Malik held on tight, pulling with everything he had. He wasn't going to let go. The man struggled, but by then, security had arrived. The mall's guards rushed in, tackling the kidnapper to the ground as he tried to fight them off. Within moments, the situation was under control. The toddler, still frightened but unharmed, was returned to his mother, who was finally noticing the chaos around her. But none of it would have happened if Malik hadn't been paying attention, if he hadn't seen the danger when no one else did. For the first time in his life, Malik had been the one to save the day, and he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't invisible anymore. Would you have noticed the danger? What would you have done? Let us know in the comments. Nobody believed Malik. Nobody helped. So he ran, alone. The kidnapper was fast, but Malik was faster. The man sprinted toward the exit, carrying the billionaire's son in his arms, the toddler still clutching his stuffed animal. Malik's mind raced as he chased him, heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the sound of his shoes pounding against the polished floor, but the man was almost out of sight, disappearing into the crowd toward the mall's exit. The door was in sight. Freedom for the criminal, and a nightmare for the little boy. Malik didn't think. He just ran after him, weaving through shoppers, knocking over display stands, sending a cascade of clothes tumbling to the floor. His eyes were locked on the kidnapper, his legs burning with each stride. But he couldn't stop. The fire inside him pushed him forward. Every step was a fight, every breath strained. "Stop him! He's taking that baby!" Malik screamed, his voice desperate, raw, but loud enough to cut through the noise. He needed someone to listen, needed someone to stop the man. But instead of halting the kidnapper, instead of helping him, people grabbed Malik instead. "Hey, kid, stop yelling!" A man's voice barked at him as a hand clamped down on his shoulder, yanking him to a stop. Malik struggled, trying to break free, but the grip tightened, pulling him back. "What are you trying to steal? Get out of here!" Another voice shouted. It was a woman, this time, pushing him aside with force. Malik's heart sank. No one believed him. They didn't see what he saw. They didn't hear the desperation in his voice or recognize the danger in front of them. They only saw a homeless kid. Someone who didn't matter. Someone who wasn't worthy of being listened to. He fought to break free, but no one would let him pass. The crowd didn't care about the child in danger, and they certainly didn't care about him. Mall security was next, pushing Malik aside with the same indifference, as if he were just another nuisance in their way. The men in uniform barely spared a glance at him before shoving him to the ground, and Malik's knees scraped painfully against the floor. The kidnapper was almost out the door now, and Malik's stomach dropped. He could hear the sound of footsteps growing fainter as the criminal neared the exit, nearly home free. Despair threatened to swallow Malik. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let them get away. His mind raced as the seconds ticked away. This was his moment, his only chance. Without thinking, he pushed himself up, his legs shaky but his determination clear. He darted toward the door, ignoring the voices around him, ignoring the hands trying to pull him back. He had to stop the kidnapper. He couldn't let him get away with it. He knew the man would disappear into the street if he got outside. The mall doors were just a few feet away, and Malik had only one chance left. With everything he had, Malik pushed through the crowd, moving as fast as he could. He wasn't thinking about the consequences. He wasn't thinking about whether or not anyone believed him. All he could think about was that child. The boy who was still in the arms of a stranger. The toddler who didn't deserve to be taken, who didn't deserve to be treated like an object. Malik's breath was ragged as he reached the door just as it started to close. With one final push, he shoved his way past a guard, his body colliding with the door, and he sprinted outside, eyes scanning the parking lot. But then he saw them. The kidnapper was nearly at the edge of the lot, but Malik was already in motion. He wasn't going to lose him. Not this time. What would you do if you saw something like this happen? Would you take action? Let us know in the comments. Malik saw the escalator rail. It was the last chance. He didn't know if it would work, didn't know if he could pull it off, but it was the only option left. The kidnapper was just ahead of him, moving quickly, the toddler still held tightly in his arms. The man was almost out of reach, almost free, but Malik was determined. He had to act fast. Without thinking, without hesitation, Malik made a split-second decision. He jumped. Malik landed with a thud on the kidnapper's shoulders, the force of the impact knocking both of them to the ground. The crowd around them gasped in shock as the two figures tumbled in a mess of limbs. Malik's heart was pounding in his chest, his hands gripping tightly onto the man's neck, trying to hold on as they hit the floor with a violent crash. For a moment, everything was a blur. Malik's head spun, and he struggled to regain his balance. The kidnapper let out a grunt of surprise, and his grip on the toddler loosened. The little boy, still clutching his stuffed animal, slipped from the man's arms and tumbled onto the floor, landing softly, unharmed. A collective gasp filled the air as the kidnapper let out a string of curses, scrambling to get back on his feet. But Malik was already up, trying to move the toddler out of harm's way. The kidnapper made one last desperate attempt to grab the boy, but before he could, security guards rushed in, their hands grabbing the man's arms and forcing him to the ground. The whole scene erupted in chaos. Voices shouted, the clatter of metal echoed as the kidnapper was restrained, and the crowd parted to make way for the security officers. But Malik barely noticed any of it. He was too focused on the toddler, who was now sitting on the ground, looking confused but unharmed. Then, through the noise, Malik heard a voice. The billionaire father, his face pale with fear and relief, ran forward, his eyes locked on his son. Without a word, he scooped the little boy into his arms, pulling him close as if he were the most precious thing in the world. The man's relief was palpable, but there was something else in his eyes, a deep gratitude that hadn't been there before. You saved him," the billionaire stammered, looking at Malik with a mix of disbelief and awe. But the moment wasn't over. As the toddler's father held him tightly, a sudden silence fell over the crowd. The truth had been revealed. Everything that had been hidden, every question that had lingered, was now coming into focus. The kidnapper, still lying on the ground, was struggling to free himself from the grip of the security guards. As he shifted, a small piece of paper fell from his pocket, a note that was quickly gathered by one of the officers. Malik didn't know what it was at first, but the guards and the billionaire father exchanged a look. The paper was handed over, and, soon enough, a detective stepped forward, reading the contents of the note aloud. It was a confession. Malik's breath caught in his throat as the detective's voice rang out with the damning words. The kidnapper had been hired by someone with a much darker agenda, someone who had planned to kidnap the child for ransom. But what Malik hadn't known, what none of them had known, was that the plot ran much deeper. The man they had just apprehended wasn't working alone. He was part of a criminal ring, one that had been targeting high-profile families for months. The billionaire's face twisted in shock as the truth came to light. His son, the child who had once seemed untouchable, was just a pawn in a much larger game. But at that moment, as Malik stood there, watching the scene unfold, something shifted. The fear in the billionaire's eyes turned into gratitude, a realization that Malik had saved the boy in the most crucial moment of his life. Malik's heart still raced, but in that moment, he felt something he had never felt before: power. Not power in the way that the rich had it, but the power of being seen, of being heard, of doing something that mattered. What would you have done if you were in Malik's position? Let us know in the comments. The police arrested the kidnapper, an ex-employee who had been fired months ago. It turned out he had been planning the crime for weeks, carefully orchestrating every detail in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The detective, now taking control of the situation, started questioning him, but the man was already defeated. He knew his scheme had failed, and now he would face the consequences of his actions. But as the chaos began to settle, something else took center stage. Malik. The billionaire, still shaken from the events that had just unfolded, looked at Malik for the first time. He had been so focused on his son's safety that he hadn't truly noticed the boy who had risked his life to save him. Now, with the situation under control, he saw Malik standing in front of him, bruised and bloodied, wearing torn clothes that barely seemed to fit his frame. Malik was a stark contrast to the world the billionaire knew. He was a boy who had lived through hardship, a boy who had faced the darkest parts of life, and yet, somehow, was still standing. It was impossible for the billionaire to ignore the truth. Malik had done what no one else could. He had saved his son. The thought weighed heavily on him as he tried to process everything that had just happened, as he realized how wrong he had been. The life he had led, one of privilege and luxury, had shielded him from the struggles others faced, and it had made him blind to the value of people like Malik. But now, as he saw the boy standing before him, it was clear that Malik had more courage, more strength, than many adults he knew. The billionaire took a step forward, his voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and curiosity. "What's your name, kid?" he asked, his words sincere, though still laced with disbelief. Malik hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering downward. He wasn't used to people asking about him, especially not people like the billionaire. But he had to answer, even though his voice felt small compared to the gravity of the situation. "Malik, sir," he said quietly, his words barely above a whisper. The billionaire nodded, taking in the name. He paused, his gaze lingering on Malik, studying the boy who had been through so much. His eyes softened as he spoke again, his tone gentler. "Where's your family?" The question hung in the air, a simple one, but one that held more weight than anything else in the moment. It was the kind of question that could offer comfort, that could open doors to a new life. But for Malik, it was the question that reminded him of everything he had lost, everything he never had. Malik looked away, his gaze dropping to the ground. The weight of his past settled on his shoulders, and the ache in his chest flared up again, the familiar emptiness that he had carried for so long. "I don't have one," Malik replied, his voice barely audible. The words were heavy with the truth, a truth that he had never fully come to terms with. He had never had a family, never had a place where he truly belonged. He had been alone for as long as he could remember, drifting through life with no one to call his own. The billionaire looked at him in silence for a long moment, the truth of Malik's situation sinking in. There was a sense of sadness in his eyes, but something else began to stir there too. It wasn't just pity, it was realization. The kind of realization that changes everything. Without warning, the billionaire reached out, placing a hand gently on Malik's shoulder. It was a gesture that held more meaning than words could express, one that Malik had never expected. "I'm sorry," the billionaire said softly, his voice filled with a sincerity Malik had never heard before. "I'm sorry for everything." Malik's eyes widened, unsure of how to respond. No one had ever apologized to him before, not for the things he had been through, not for the way people had treated him. But here, in this moment, the billionaire's apology felt different. It felt like an opening, like something had shifted. And then, the billionaire did something nobody expected. He paused, looking Malik in the eyes, his expression filled with something Malik had never seen in a person of his wealth. It was not condescension, not the usual pity that came with charity. It was genuine care. "I want to offer you something," the billionaire said, his voice steady now. "A chance. a chance at a future, a chance to make something of yourself. You deserve more than this life. You deserve a family." Malik's breath caught in his throat. He had never been offered anything like this before. The thought of belonging, of finally having someone to call family, was a dream he had never dared to hope for. In that moment, everything changed. What do you think? Should Malik accept the billionaire's offer? Let us know in the comments. A hero deserves more than a thank you. Days later, Malik stood in front of a huge mansion, the kind of place he had never imagined stepping foot in, let alone calling home. He stood still, taking in the grandeur of the house, the pristine yard, and the enormous gates. His hands shook slightly as he held a brand-new backpack, fresh clothes, and a contract, an official, legal document in his hands. The weight of it all was almost overwhelming, but it was real. Everything was real. The billionaire walked up beside him, his eyes filled with something more than just gratitude. There was respect in his gaze, something Malik hadn't felt in a long time, maybe ever. He knelt down beside him, his expression serious but gentle. "You saved my son," the billionaire said, his voice sincere and thick with emotion. "I can never repay you for that. But I can give you a future." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that Malik could feel in every inch of his body. The life Malik had known, one filled with hunger, struggle, and loneliness, was now a distant memory. A new chapter was about to begin, one that was filled with opportunities he had never imagined. The billionaire took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Malik's. "I've signed the papers. From now on, this is your home." The words hung in the air like a promise of safety, a promise of belonging. Malik's chest tightened, and for a moment he thought he might burst into tears, but he didn't. He stood there, frozen, still trying to process what had just been offered to him. He had spent his entire life moving from one place to the next, never staying long enough to call anything his. He had always been invisible, unnoticed by those around him. But now, for the first time, he was being seen. He was being given a chance. Malik glanced down at the contract in his hands, still in disbelief. He wasn't just a homeless boy anymore. He was a member of a family who cared about him, a family who saw him for who he truly was. He didn't have to survive anymore. He could live. "You don't have to thank me," the billionaire added, his voice softening. "You've already done more than I could ever ask for." The sincerity in his tone made Malik's heart swell with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. Malik looked at him, the weight of everything sinking in. The billionaire wasn't just giving him a place to stay. He was offering him a future, a chance at a life that Malik had never thought possible. A life with security, a chance to learn, to grow, to become something he had always dreamed of, but never dared to hope for. For the first time, Malik smiled, a smile that came from deep within. It wasn't just a simple expression of happiness. It was a smile that symbolized everything he had fought for, everything he had endured. In that moment, he realized that he had saved not only the child that day, but himself too. He had taken the chance to act when no one else would, and in doing so, he had found his own salvation. Malik stood taller than he ever had before. The weight of his past no longer crushed him, and the future no longer seemed so uncertain. He didn't know exactly what that future would hold, but for the first time, he knew that he wasn't alone. He had a place in this world, and that place was here, surrounded by people who saw him for who he was, Would you have done what Malik did? Comment below, like, and share if you believe in second chances.